In 1936, Ilse Koch arrived at Sachsenhausen as the wife of an SS officer. She had no uniform, no official position, but within 2 years she was conducting punishments, ordering medical experiments, and organizing orgies among prisoners under armed guard. For 6 years, she turned her residence at Buchenwald into a private center of sexual humiliation and planned sadism. She selected tattooed inmates to be murdered and skinned. It was at the heart of a system of unchecked abuse. Why did no one within the SS stop her excesses? What did her superiors know about her forced orgies? And how did she manage to evade justice even after the fall of the Reich? From the shadows of Dresden, the origin of Ilse Koch. In Dresden, at the dawn of the 20th century, the cultural splendor of the Florence on the Elbe masked the social tensions that would transform Europe. Margarete Ilse Koch was born on September 22, 1906, into a working-class family, to a foreman father whose modest income guaranteed stability but little else. Dresden's Baroque architecture and artistic heritage stood in stark contrast to the industrial neighborhoods where families like the Kohlers lived their daily lives, a microcosm of the sharpening class divisions in Imperial Germany. Ilse's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of military parades and the nationalist fervor that characterized pre-war Germany. At 8 years old, she witnessed the outbreak of World War I, absorbing the militaristic atmosphere that permeated every aspect of society. Schools became vehicles of patriotic indoctrination, teaching children to revere the Kaiser and despise Germany's enemies. Young Ilse, like many of her generation, grew up within this framework of rigid authority and unquestioning obedience, elements that would later define the Nazi worldview. The German defeat in 1918 shattered these certainties. The collapse of the monarchy, the birth of the Weimar Republic, and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles created profound disorientation. For teenagers like Ilse, coming of age amidst this national trauma, the world seemed fundamentally unstable. The hyperinflation of 1923 dealt another blow. Entire families saw their life savings evaporate in a matter of days. Money became worthless. Workers received their wages in wheelbarrows and paid astronomical sums for basic goods. This economic catastrophe fueled widespread resentment and a desperate search for scapegoats. During these turbulent years, Ilse attended commercial school, mastering typing, accounting, and administrative skills. These pragmatic qualifications led her to a series of secretarial positions throughout the 1920s in various Dresden offices. On the surface, she seemed well adapted to the realities of modern working life, a young woman forging her independence in the new German democracy. Her employment records from this period reveal a competent and disciplined worker with no notable infractions. Yet beneath this conventional exterior, the seeds of ideological extremism found fertile ground. The Nazi Party, with its promise to restore German greatness, captivated millions of disaffected citizens. In 1932, a year before Hitler took power, Ilse Koch joined the NSDAP. This decision marked her transition from passive discontent to active participation in the movement that would transform Germany into a totalitarian state. Saxony, where Dresden was located, had become a bastion of Nazi support, with influential party officials establishing close networks throughout the region. For women like Ilse, the Nazi Party offered a distinctive vision. While emphasizing motherhood as women's primary duty, Nazi ideology also created avenues for female participation in public life as long as it served the regime's objectives. The Third Reich established the ideal of womanhood as racially pure, morally upright, and physically robust. Women were simultaneously exalted as mothers of the Aryan race and reduced to their reproductive function. The regime awarded the German Mother Cross of Honor to women with 4 or more children, while implementing forced sterilization programs for those deemed unworthy of reproducing. In 1934, as the Nazi consolidation of power accelerated, Ilse's involvement in the party brought her into contact with SS circles. At social gatherings organized by local Nazi officials, she met Karl Otto Koch, an SS officer who had begun his career in the concentration camp system. Koch, born in 1897, was already establishing himself within Heinrich Himmler's elite organization. His authoritarian temperament and ruthless efficiency made him a valuable asset in the expanding apparatus of repression. Their courtship developed in the context of increasing persecution of Jews, political opponents, and other targeted groups. For Ilse, Koch represented not only a romantic partner but also access to power and status within the new order. Their marriage was authorized by the SS Race and Resettlement Office, which examined each union to ensure the couple's genetic purity. To pass this test, Ilse had to prove her Aryan ancestry and undergo medical examinations certifying her fertility and health. In 1936, Karl Otto Koch was appointed commandant of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin. Ilse accompanied him, settling into the commandant's villa within the camp itself. This move marked her definitive entry into the world of concentration camps. She was no longer just the wife of an officer. She was a first-hand witness to the most brutal repressive system of the 20th century. The Witch of Buchenwald, terror and pleasure in human flesh. In the spring of 1937, Karl Otto Koch received orders to establish a new concentration camp near Weimar on a wooded hill known as the Ettersberg. This place of natural beauty, historically associated with the poet Goethe's walks, would become synonymous with horror under the name Buchenwald, beech forest. The Kochs moved to this enclave of terror, settling into an elegant villa just yards from the camp perimeter, an obscene contrast between luxury and suffering that would characterize their entire stay. Buchenwald represented the evolution of the Nazi concentration camp system. Unlike the earlier makeshift camps, its architecture reflected meticulous planning, 33 barracks arranged in a semicircle, surrounded by electrified fences, watchtowers, and a containment pit. The camp included industrial workshops for forced labor, medical laboratories for experiments, a crematorium, and the infamous bunker, a punishment block where torture methods were constantly being refined. This complex was designed not only to contain prisoners, but to systematically break bodies and wills. The first inmates arrived in July 1937, mainly political opponents, homosexuals, and asocials in Nazi terminology. They had to build the camp itself, working in inhumane conditions under the whips of the guards. Mortality in this initial phase was terrifying. The grueling labor, deliberate malnutrition, and brutal punishments turned every day into a struggle for survival. Karl Otto oversaw this machinery with bureaucratic efficiency, while Ilse began to define her own role, going beyond official protocol. Although she held no formal position within the camp structure, Ilse Koch wielded considerable power. Her presence was unmistakable: neatly groomed blonde hair, elegant dresses often in red, and shiny riding boots. Her image soon became etched in the minds of the inmates as a harbinger of danger. The prisoners dubbed her Die Hexe von Buchenwald, the Witch of Buchenwald, a nickname that reflected both her influence and the terror she inspired. The internal regime at Buchenwald combined lethal forced labor with arbitrary violence. Prisoners rose before dawn to endure endless morning formations, often in rain or snow. 12 hours of grueling labor followed in quarries, armament factories, or construction projects. Starvation was a deliberate policy. The rations, scientifically calculated to keep the inmates barely alive, consisted primarily of substandard black bread and a watery soup of no nutritional value. This systematic malnutrition weakened physical stamina and broke the will. In this environment where human life was valued, Ilse Koch refined her own methods of cruelty. Her first instrument of terror was her horse, a black stallion on which she rode around the camp, whipping prisoners for trivial or imagined infractions. Mounted, she stood above the mass of people, physically establishing her dominance. What would make Ilse Koch a legendary figure of Nazi perversion was her fascination with tattooed human skin. Around 1939, she developed a morbid interest in prisoners with elaborate tattoos on their bodies: sailors, ex-convicts, men with artistic decorations on their arms or torsos. This obsession soon became a system. She would identify inmates with interesting tattoos and point them out to guards. Days later, these prisoners would disappear. Her relationship with camp doctor Erich Wagner deepened this macabre practice. Wagner, who conducted pseudoscientific research on tattoos as supposed indicators of criminality, shared Ilse's interest. Together, they established an unofficial protocol. Selected prisoners were killed, usually by lethal injection, and their bodies sent to the pathology ward. There, specialized technicians removed the tattooed skin, preserved it using chemical procedures, and prepared it for various uses. Objects made from human skin began to appear at the Koch residence: lampshades decorated with tribal or nautical motifs taken from sailor skin, book bindings with tattooed fragments, gloves, and other personal accessories. Although years later during the trials, some experts would question the authenticity of certain objects attributed specifically to Ilse, it is undeniable that a systematic program of harvesting human remains, including tattooed skin, existed at Buchenwald, and that Ilse Koch was directly involved in its conception and implementation. implementation. The collaboration between the Kochs, Wagner, Hoven, and other officers created a web of complicity where cruelty was both method and entertainment. The orgies at Villa Koch became well-known rituals among the SS elite. High-ranking officers and their wives participated in soirees where alcohol flowed freely and moral barriers completely dissolved. These gatherings often included spectacles, with prisoners forced into various degrading acts. The pornography of violence was normalized, turning human suffering into a backdrop for the executioner's amusement. Ilse Koch's power at Buchenwald transcended her formal status as the commandant's wife. She had become an authority figure recognized by guards and officers, capable of ordering punishments or even executions. Her influence extended to areas theoretically outside her jurisdiction, selecting prisoners for experiments, assigning particularly lethal tasks, determining punishments. She wasn't just a privileged observer of the system, she was a key operator within its machinery. By 1941, her notoriety had already transcended the camp's boundaries. Among prisoners transferred from other camps, the witch's reputation preceded their encounter with her. In the highest circles of the SS, Ilse Koch was viewed with a mixture of admiration and concern. Her brazenness and excesses were striking even in a system based on systematic brutality. But as the Third Reich advanced victoriously through Europe, her position seemed impregnable. Who would question the wife of an efficient commander in the midst of a world war? However, already that year, the first pieces of what would be her downfall were in motion. A system as brutal as the Nazis did not tolerate internal corruption, and the Kochs, in their arrogance, had begun to accumulate enemies even within the SS itself. The Witch of Buchenwald would soon face her own coven, not for cruelty, commonplace in the Reich, but for something the Nazi system considered unforgivable: economic corruption and personal enrichment at the expense of the state. Sex, sadism, and silence, the Kochs' private circus. The Koch mansion, with its elegant salons and garden carefully maintained by prisoners, stood like a fortress of privilege amidst mass suffering. From its windows, one could see the barracks where thousands of men were crammed into inhumane conditions, but within its walls, luxury reigned. This residence would be the epicenter of a privatized system of cruelty, where the official sadism of the Nazi regime merged with the personal perversions of the Koch couple. The sexualization of power reached its most perverse expression in Ilse's control over other people's bodies. A common practice was to select prisoners for domestic service at her residence, where she subjected them to constant humiliation. She forced them to bathe her while she remained naked, disparagingly commenting on their bodies emaciated by hunger. "Look at you, so bony, so ugly," she would say, while demanding that they dry her hair or brush it. The contrast between her well-fed figure and the skeletal prisoners was a deliberate part of the humiliation. Ilse had developed a particular method of provocation. She would walk around the camp in tight dresses, often a deep red, a forbidden color for prisoners, and adopt provocative poses near the work groups. Any prisoner who so much as glanced at her was immediately punished. This systematic entrapment turned repressed desire into condemnation, using sexuality as another form of psychological torture. In an environment where looking a guard in the eye could mean death, Ilse transformed her physical presence into a minefield of terror. His cruelty took specific forms depending on the gender of his victims. With female prisoners, he showed particular cruelty toward those who retained some physical attractiveness despite the camp conditions, ordering their hair shaved or assigning them to the most degrading jobs. With men, especially younger ones, he enjoyed ordering punishments that stripped them of dignity: forced nudity, humiliating positions, sexualized violence. This differentiation revealed a perverse calculation in his sadism, an intuitive understanding of how to maximize humiliation based on the specific vulnerabilities of each gender. On Sundays, her routine included riding around the camp on horseback, allowing herself to personally select prisoners for arbitrary punishments. Her relationship with several camp doctors added another dimension to her reign of cruelty. Dr. Erich Wagner, a pathologist obsessed with tattoos as supposed indicators of criminality, found an enthusiastic collaborator in Ilse. Together, they developed a system for documenting, classifying, and preserving fragments of human skin. Prisoners with interesting tattoos were photographed before their removal, creating a macabre catalogue. After their death, usually by lethal injection to spare the skin, trained technicians meticulously removed the tattooed fragments, chemically treated them, and prepared them for various decorative uses. Ilse also maintained a close relationship with Dr. Waldemar Hoven, Buchenwald's chief physician and responsible for numerous lethal experiments. Hoven, known for his research on typhus and toxic substances, allowed Ilse to witness some of the procedures. According to later accounts, she showed particular interest in the exact moment of death, closely observing the reactions of patients undergoing experimental injections. This fascination with the boundary between life and death represented an additional dimension of her perversion, fusing morbid curiosity with sadistic pleasure. The rapes, both witnessed and ordered by Ilse, were part of the system of terror at Buchenwald. They were not spontaneous acts, but organized procedures under her supervision. On some occasions, male prisoners were forced to rape female prisoners while officers watched. On other occasions, homosexual inmates were forced to perform sexual acts with women, using sexual violence as punishment for their sexual orientation. These episodes were designed not only as entertainment for the spectators, but as a systematic destruction of the victim's dignity and resilience. The accounts of these practices coincide on one chilling detail: Ilse's expression during these sessions. Surviving prisoners described how her face would transform, showing obvious signs of sexual arousal at the suffering of others. A former Polish prisoner testified, her eyes would shine and her breathing would visibly quicken. She could not hide the pleasure our humiliation gave her. This direct link between cruelty and sexual arousal would define Ilse Koch's specific pathology, a sadism that transcended the ideological justifications of the Nazi system to reveal itself as a personal perversion. Among SS officers, attitudes toward Ilse's behavior ranged from enthusiastic participation to hushed discomfort. Some fully shared her fascination with the suffering of others. Others felt that her excesses compromised the camp's efficiency, but no one dared question the commandant's wife. This web of complicity and silence allowed her practices to become normalized for years. Only the prisoners, involuntary witnesses to her cruelty, maintained perspective on the anomalous nature of her behavior, even in the brutal context of a concentration camp. The silence wasn't limited to the perpetrators. Among the prisoners themselves, there was an unspoken code, not to speak of Ilse Koch beyond what was strictly necessary. Her name sent shivers down the spine. Those who had witnessed her selections or suffered her punishments preferred not to remember. This pact of silence was born of terror but also of shame. The sexual humiliation left psychological scars that many preferred to bury. The true magnitude of her crimes would only emerge years later during the post-war trials, when survivors were finally able to testify in a safe environment. Ilse's influence extended beyond her residence and the camp's perimeter. In the nearby city of Weimar, she was known as a demanding customer in the exclusive shops, where she spent considerable sums on clothing, jewelry, and luxury goods. The origin of this money, systematically stolen from prisoners, was an open secret. The citizens of Weimar, who lived with the presence of the camp just a few kilometers away, practiced a studied form of ignorance. They looked the other way when the Kochs and other officials strolled through their streets, enjoying privileges built on human suffering. The Reich's revenge, when the SS executed their own. In August 1941, as panzer divisions advanced through the heart of the Soviet Union and the Reich seemed invincible, the downfall of the Kochs began to unfold. Josias von Waldeck-Pyrmont, a high-ranking SS officer and police chief in the Weimar region, launched an investigation into financial irregularities at Buchenwald. What began as a routine audit would soon uncover a web of corruption, covert murders, and self-enrichment that would land Karl Otto Koch before a firing squad and Ilse before international justice. The spark that ignited the investigation was a name in the Buchenwald death registers: Walter Kramer. This prisoner was no ordinary inmate. A doctor by profession and a communist imprisoned for his political beliefs, Kramer had treated Waldeck himself for a serious illness years earlier, possibly saving his life. His sudden death, recorded as natural causes, immediately aroused suspicion. Intrigued, Waldeck ordered an investigation into the exact circumstances of his death. What investigators discovered was disturbing even by SS standards. Kramer and his assistant Karl Pikes had been executed under the direct orders of Karl Otto Koch. The real motive: both were privy to a secret the commandant considered potentially devastating to his career. Koch suffered from syphilis, a venereal disease that directly contradicted the image of racial purity demanded of SS officers. In the racial hygiene-obsessed hierarchy of the Third Reich, such an illness, especially one associated with promiscuity, was sufficient reason for loss of rank, prestige, and position. Kramer had discreetly treated Koch for months with the limited medical resources available at the camp. He had done so under threat, but also in the hope of improving the overall conditions of the camp infirmary. When the treatment began to show results, Koch decided to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Kramer and Pei were falsely accused of subversive activities and executed without formal trial. Their bodies were immediately cremated, eliminating any physical evidence. The investigation revealed a third murder linked to this secret. A prisoner had been assigned to fetch water outside the camp perimeter, an unusual task that would normally have required an armed escort. While performing this task, he was shot dead by guards stationed in the watchtowers. The official report recorded an escape attempt, but investigators discovered that this prisoner had also participated in Koch's secret treatment. He was another witness permanently silenced. To eliminate any trace of the scandal, Koch had even enlisted the help of Dr. Waldemar Hoven, chief physician at Buchenwald and Ilse's occasional lover. Hoven murdered an SS member named Köhler, who was also aware of Koch's illness. The method was clinical, a lethal injection of phenol directly into the heart, a technique Hoven had perfected in his experiments with prisoners. The death was recorded as cardiac arrest, initially raising no suspicion. This string of murders revealed not only Koch's desperation to protect his reputation, but also the existence of a network of complicity within the camp. Ilse Koch was fully aware of these crimes. Moreover, she had actively participated in identifying potential problematic witnesses and pressured her husband to eliminate them. Her relationship with Hoven gave her additional influence over the camp's medical establishment, allowing her to access privileged information and manipulate records when necessary. Concurrent with the investigation into these murders, evidence of systematic corruption within the Koch administration emerged. The couple had amassed a considerable personal fortune through the organized theft of prisoners' possessions. Jewelry, cash, watches, valuable pieces of art, everything was siphoned into their pockets instead of being handed over to the Reich treasury as official protocol stipulated. They maintained bank accounts in Switzerland where they had deposited substantial sums extracted from the suffering of Buchenwald inmates. The most ostentatious manifestation of this illicit enrichment was the indoor riding arena that Karl ordered built in 1940 as a gift for Ilse, a keen equestrian. This luxurious facility, which cost more than 250,000 Reichsmarks, was financed with money stolen from prisoners of war. In the midst of World War II, when the German economy was completely geared toward the war effort, the Kochs indulged in such personal extravaganzas, an insult to the austerity officially demanded of the German population. The investigation produced devastating results. In December 1941, Karl Otto Koch was temporarily relieved of his duties as commandant of Buchenwald. However, the intervention of Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, prevented more serious immediate consequences. Koch, although questioned, was simply transferred to the Majdanek concentration camp in occupied Poland. This decision reflected the complex power dynamics within the SS. While some officers demanded exemplary punishment, others preferred to protect the public image of the elite force by avoiding scandals. For Ilse, this first blow meant a temporary reduction in her influence but not its elimination. Although her husband had been transferred, she remained in the Buchenwald villa, maintaining her lifestyle and many of her privileges. The network of contacts and accomplices she had forged over the years provided her with some protection. Officials who had participated in her private parties or benefited from her corrupt schemes had reason to keep her safe. Nevertheless, the investigation continued to move forward methodically. SS Judge Konrad Morgan, known for his relentless pursuit of internal corruption, took charge of the case in 1943. Morgan represented a peculiar contradiction of the Nazi system, a scrupulous jurist who pursued technical violations while ignoring the mass crimes against humanity that constituted the camp's central purpose. For Morgan, the murder of prisoners was not problematic as long as it followed authorized channels. What was intolerable was doing it without official permission or for personal gain. Under Morgan's direction, the investigation gained new momentum. Statements were taken from numerous witnesses, both SS officers and prisoners in administrative positions. Financial records, bank transfers, and invoices for luxury purchases were reviewed. The case against the Kochs grew steadily. Finally, on August 24, 1943, both Karl and Ilse were formally arrested. Their trial took place in an internal SS court, away from public scrutiny. Karl Otto Koch faced serious charges: embezzlement of Reich funds, misappropriation of property, unauthorized murder of prisoners, and falsification of official documents. The SS tribunal found him guilty in December 1944 and sentenced him to death. an unusually harsh punishment that reflected Himmler's determination to maintain disciplinary control even as the Reich began to crumble. Ilse Koch, for her part, was accused of complicity in embezzlement and illicit enrichment. Surprisingly, the charges made no mention of her personal cruelties against prisoners or her collection of objects made from human skin, which from the twisted perspective of SS justice did not constitute prosecutable offenses. The court found her not guilty for lack of conclusive evidence, largely because the financial records were primarily in her husband's name. This technical acquittal reflected both the loopholes in the case and the effectiveness of her defense strategy. Following the verdict, Ilse was released from SS custody and briefly returned to civilian life. She settled into a small apartment in Ludwigsburg, where she lived relatively discreetly as the Reich disintegrated under the Allied advance. The war that had provided the context for her reign of terror was drawing to a close, and with it, the protection of the system that had facilitated her crimes. Karl Otto Koch remained imprisoned until April 1945. In an ironic twist of fate, he was transferred back to Buchenwald for execution. On April 5th, just days before the camp's liberation by American troops, he was shot by an SS firing squad in the very place where he had wielded absolute power. His death, ordered by the very regime he had served with brutal efficiency, exemplified the implacable logic of the Nazi system. Even its most loyal servants were expendable when their actions threatened the image and stability of the organization. The liberation of Buchenwald, the truth that the Reich wanted to bury. In April 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled under the relentless Allied advance, Buchenwald vibrated with palpable tension. The prisoners, exhausted after years of forced labor and systematic starvation, sensed that something fundamental was changing. The distant sound of artillery grew closer every day. Nervous guards burned documents and prepared for evacuation. The message was clear. The Americans were approaching, and the SS planned to erase the evidence of their crimes. The camp's population had reached critical levels. More than 48,000 people were crammed into facilities designed for half that number. This overcrowding was a result of the Nazi policy of evacuating eastern camps in anticipation of the Soviet advance. Long columns of skeletal prisoners had arrived from Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and other camps, many dying en route. Those who survived found even more precarious conditions at Buchenwald: overcrowded barracks, reduced rations, and collapsed sanitary facilities. In this context, forced evacuations began. Beginning on April 6th, the camp administration organized death marches to facilities further from the front. Thousands of prisoners were forced to walk for miles with little food or rest. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were executed on the spot. These evacuations pursued a dual objective: to keep slave labor available for the war effort and to eliminate potential witnesses to the crimes committed. Among the prisoners remaining in the camp, a chilling rumor circulated: an order for total extermination. According to information leaked by administrative workers, the Gestapo had ordered the complete elimination of the inmates before the Americans arrived. The plan included concentrating the prisoners in the barracks, setting them on fire, and machine gunning those who tried to escape. This imminent threat galvanized the underground resistance operating within Buchenwald. This resistance, organized primarily by German, Polish, and Soviet political prisoners, had spent years building a secret network within the camp. They had managed to infiltrate members into key administrative positions, hide some weapons, and establish a communication system between barracks. Their most notable achievement was a clandestine radio transmitter built with parts stolen from the camp's electrical workshops. This device, hidden in a false wall of the film barracks, represented their only potential contact with the outside world. On April 8, 1945, at 4:30 p.m., the resistance operators made a critical decision. Using the improvised transmitter, they sent a desperate message in Morse code: to Allied troops, SOS. This is the Buchenwald concentration camp. We request urgent assistance. They want to evacuate us. The SS wants to destroy us. The weak but clear signal was picked up by communications units of the American Third Army. The reply came back within minutes. KZ Bu. Hold position. Hold, we are coming to your aid. Third Army headquarters. That same day, the resistance received vital information from a prisoner working the telephone switchboard. The Weimar Gestapo had called, ordering the immediate destruction of the camp and the elimination of all inmates. In an act of extraordinary courage and ingenuity, the prisoner who answered the call pretended to be an SS officer and replied, "Understood. The destruction has already been carried out as ordered. The camp is completely destroyed." This audacious lie temporarily confused the Nazi authorities and bought the prisoners precious time. On April 11th, as evacuations intensified and the situation grew desperate, the resistance took action. They had previously distributed some weapons, mainly improvised knives and a few stolen pistols among select groups of prisoners. At a prearranged signal, they simultaneously stormed several watchtowers and guard posts. Most of the SS had already fled, leaving control to auxiliary guards less committed to the Nazi cause. They offered little resistance. Within hours, the prisoners had effectively taken control of the camp. That same afternoon at 3 o'clock, the vanguard of the U.S. Army's 6th Armored Division reached the gates of Buchenwald. The American soldiers, hardened by months of combat, were paralyzed by the sight they encountered. More than 21,000 survivors in extreme physical condition greeted them with a mixture of desperate jubilation and disbelief. Many prisoners were too weak to move. Others, wasted by diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis, would die in the following days despite emergency medical care. Captain Friedrich Keffer, who commanded the first patrol to enter the camp, would later record his impressions. "No military training could have prepared my men for what we saw. The bodies stacked like cordwood beside the crematorium, the living barely distinguishable from the dead in the barracks. The smell, that smell none of us will ever forget. This was not conventional warfare, it was something far worse." During their initial inspection of the camp, American officials discovered physical evidence of atrocities that defied comprehension. In the pathology block, they found containers with preserved human organs, heads shrunken using special techniques, and most disturbingly, objects made from human skin. Lampshades decorated with tattoos, book bindings, gloves, and other items were catalogued and photographed as evidence of war crimes. In the camp archives, partially burned but recoverable, they found detailed records of the medical experiments conducted there. Documentation of deliberate infections with pathogens, tests of resistance to hunger and cold, and lethal injections of experimental substances. Names of responsible physicians, numbers of subjects used, and survival statistics. The brutality had been meticulously documented with German bureaucratic precision. General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, visited Buchenwald days after its liberation. His reaction, according to witnesses, combined horror, fury, and determination. "I want the whole world to see this," he ordered. "I want witnesses. I want no one to be able to say one day that this didn't happen." Following these instructions, on April 16, 1945, 1,000 German civilians from the nearby city of Weimar were forced to visit the camp and witness firsthand the atrocities being committed miles from their homes. This forced visit has been captured in historic photographs, neatly dressed German middle-class men and women walking between rows of corpses or in front of the crematorium ovens. Some cover their faces, others weep, many display expressions of disbelief. When some attempted to plead ignorance, American officials pointed out the smoke that had been rising for years from the crematorium chimneys, visible from the city, and the distinctive odor that the wind regularly carried toward Weimar. Among the liberators, Ilse Koch's name quickly emerged as a symbol of horror. Survivors spoke of her with palpable fear, describing her cruelties in terms American soldiers found hard to believe. The collection of human skin artifacts attributed directly to her became central evidence of her sadism. Although Ilse was no longer at Buchenwald, she had been arrested months earlier by the SS and subsequently liberated. Her legacy of terror remained intact. The liberation of Buchenwald provided the world with some of the first documentary images of the Holocaust. U.S. Army film crews extensively filmed the camp, its facilities, and its survivors. These images, along with professional photographs, were distributed internationally. The impact was immediate and profound. For many people in the West, it was the first visual exposure to the realities of the Nazi concentration camp system. Margaret Bourke-White, Life magazine, produced some of the most iconic images of liberated Buchenwald. Her photographs of survivors behind barbed wire, piled-up corpses, and crematoriums defined the visual representation of the Holocaust for later generations. As she would write, "I used my camera as a protective shield between my sensibilities and the horror I was witnessing. Only later, upon developing the images, did the reality fully hit me." The documentation collected at Buchenwald would prove crucial to future war crimes trials. U.S. military personnel, following War Department directives, meticulously catalogued physical evidence, collected sworn testimony from survivors, and preserved the camp's administrative records. This forensic methodology, replicated at other liberated camps, would lay the groundwork for international jurisprudence on crimes against humanity. For the survivors, liberation marked the end of their captivity but not their suffering. Many would discover they were the only survivors of entire families. Entire Jewish communities had been exterminated. Homes and property had been confiscated or destroyed. A return to normalcy was impossible. Some would remain in displaced persons camps for years, unable to return to countries now under Soviet control or unwilling to return to societies that had betrayed them. The liberation of Buchenwald, like that of other camps, revealed a truth that the Reich had desperately tried to conceal: the existence of an industrialized system of death and torture without historical precedent. The physical evidence, testimony, and recovered documents would not only expose the extent of Nazi horror, but would fundamentally transform the global understanding of what human beings are capable of inflicting on others. And in this landscape of systemic cruelty, figures like Ilse Koch would stand out as paradigmatic examples of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. Judgment Day, the suicide of the most infamous Nazi warden. On June 30th, 1945, just over 2 months after the German surrender, Ilse Koch was arrested by American occupation forces in Ludwigsburg, where she had tried to remain unnoticed after the fall of the Reich. She was identified on the street by a former Buchenwald prisoner who immediately alerted the military authorities. At the time of her arrest, Ilse was carrying false documents and had altered her appearance, dyeing her characteristic blonde hair dark brown. This attempt to evade justice proved futile in the face of the immediate recognition of those who had suffered under her authority. During her initial interrogations, Ilse adopted a defensive strategy she would maintain throughout her court proceedings: absolute denial. She claimed to be unaware of any atrocities committed at Buchenwald, presenting herself as a simple housewife devoted to her children and unaware of camp activities. "I never entered the prisoner quarters," she declared. "My husband never discussed camp matters with me. I was solely concerned with my home and my children." This image of innocent domesticity contrasted radically with the hundreds of testimonies that placed her at the center of some of the camp's cruelest practices. American authorities held her in custody while they gathered evidence for a formal trial. The process was part of a broader effort to bring those responsible for Nazi war crimes to justice. While top Reich leaders faced the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, American military tribunals were established at Dachau to try lower-ranking personnel directly linked to the concentration camps. On April 11, 1947, the Buchenwald trial, United States of America v. Josias Prince zu Waldeck et al. Formally began at the former Dachau concentration camp, which had been converted into a military tribunal for the occasion. Among the 31 defendants, Ilse Koch was the only woman. Dressed soberly and maintaining a studied composure, she faced charges of participation in a common plan to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, a legal formulation that encompassed her multiple atrocities under the umbrella of an organized criminal conspiracy. The chief prosecutor, Lieutenant Colonel William Denson, presented a meticulously constructed case. More than 200 witnesses, mostly former prisoners, provided detailed testimony about his cruelties. The most shocking accusations concerned his collection of objects made from tattooed human skin. Former inmates described how he would single out prisoners with artistic tattoos during horseback rides, pointing at them with his riding crop, gestures that were tantamount to death sentences. Additionally, numerous witnesses described her direct involvement in beatings and torture. One former Soviet prisoner testified, "Frau Koch not only ordered punishments but often administered them personally. I saw her beat a young Russian man unconscious while she smiled." Others described her practice of sexually provoking prisoners with suggestive clothing and then ordering severe punishments for anyone who looked at her. Ilse's defense, led by a court-appointed American military lawyer, focused on questioning the reliability of witnesses and denying their direct involvement in atrocities. She argued that many testimonies were vindictive exaggerations by former prisoners or cases of mistaken identity. Regarding the human skin objects, her defense argued that while such items existed at Buchenwald, there was no conclusive evidence linking them personally to her. The strategy sought to create sufficient reasonable doubt about her direct involvement. An unexpected twist occurred during the trial. Ilse Koch was pregnant. This revelation caused a stir, given that she had been in American custody for almost 2 years. Further investigation determined that she had had relations with a German prisoner who worked as an orderly at the facility where she was held. The news generated mixed reactions. Some saw it as a calculated tactic to avoid the death penalty. Pregnant women could not be executed under American military regulations conditions, while others questioned the security and supervision at the detention centers. On August 14, 1947, the court issued its verdict. Ilse Koch was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Along with 22 of the 31 defendants, she received a life sentence. The sentence, although severe, represented a commutation of the death penalty due to her advanced pregnancy. In October 1947, while serving her sentence in the Landsberg Women's Prison, she gave birth to a son she named Uwe. The child was immediately taken from her and placed in foster care. What happened next would spark an international controversy. In January 1949, General Lucius D. Clay, military governor of the American occupation zone in Germany, reviewed her case and drastically reduced her sentence to 4 years, citing insufficient evidence for a life sentence. Specifically, Clay found that her personal responsibility for the fabrication of objects from human skin, the most emblematic accusation against her, had not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This decision sparked public outrage and political protests, especially in the United States. The U.S. Senate held specific hearings on the Koch case. Lawmakers publicly questioned Clay's decision, suggesting political pressure or judicial incompetence. The controversy was widely covered in the international press. The case became a symbol of the challenges and contradictions of post-war justice. After serving her reduced sentence, Ilse Koch was released from American custody in October 1949. Her freedom lasted only a few hours. Immediately after leaving the military prison, she was arrested by the German police. The authorities of the newly established Federal Republic of Germany had initiated their own trial against her for crimes committed against German citizens, a jurisdiction that the American military tribunals had not covered. This new trial would be conducted under German law and before a German civilian court. Ilse Koch's second trial began on November 27, 1950, at the Augsburg Regional Court. This trial would prove more exhaustive than the previous one. Over 7 weeks, 250 witnesses testified, including former prisoners, SS guards, camp doctors, and administrative staff. The German prosecution presented meticulously organized evidence, including original Buchenwald documents recovered from partially destroyed Nazi archives. Unlike the American military tribunal, the German trial focused specifically on individual cases of abuse and murder, not on the broader concept of a common criminal plan. The prosecution identified 135 specific cases of incitement to murder in which Ilse had specifically designated prisoners for elimination. Additionally, dozens of documented instances of torture and physical abuse ordered or directly perpetrated by her were presented. During this trial, Ilse's physical and mental health began to deteriorate visibly. In December 1950, she collapsed in the courtroom and had to be removed. The incident was repeated in January 1951. Prison doctors reported symptoms consistent with acute stress disorder, severe insomnia, panic attacks, and dissociative periods. However, psychiatric examinations found her competent to continue with the trial. On January 15, 1951, the German court issued its verdict, supported by a 111-page brief. Ilse Koch was found guilty of incitement to murder, aiding and abetting attempted murder, and causing serious bodily harm to prisoners. She received a life sentence with permanent loss of civil rights. The court explicitly rejected her defense of ignorance, citing overwhelming evidence of direct and conscious participation in a system of organized brutality. After her final sentence, she was transferred to the Reich Women's Prison in Bavaria to serve her sentence. The next 16 years would reveal a gradual descent into psychosis. Prison reports document a steady deterioration in her mental state. Initially, she maintained a certain composure, but over time she developed persecutory delusions and auditory hallucinations. She claimed that the ghosts of Buchenwald prisoners entered her cell at night to torture her. "They come to take my skin," she told a prison psychiatrist in 1955. "They want to make lampshades of me." Throughout her imprisonment, she submitted multiple petitions for pardon. All were rejected by the Bavarian Ministry of Justice. The authorities felt that the severity of her crimes precluded any consideration of clemency, even in the face of her obvious mental deterioration. By 1960, she rarely participated in prison activities. She remained isolated, talking to herself for hours at a time, drawing repetitive patterns on her cell walls with chalk or her own fingernails. A crucial factor in her mental breakdown was the fate of her children. Her eldest son, Artwin Koch, born during her marriage to Karl Otto, gradually discovered the truth about his parents as he grew up. In the early 1960s, as an adult, he independently investigated his parents' crimes. The impact of these discoveries was devastating. In 1967, unable to bear the weight of the family legacy, Artwin committed suicide. News of her son's suicide reached Ilse in prison and precipitated her final breakdown. For weeks, she refused to eat, spoke incoherently, and displayed self-harming behavior. Guards reported that she spent hours muttering the names of people who had died decades earlier. "They're all together now," she repeated. "They're all waiting for me on the other side." Her deterioration was so evident that authorities briefly considered transferring her to a psychiatric institution, but ultimately decided to keep her in Reich under intensified medical supervision. On September 1, 1967, Ilse Koch ended her life. Using strips of sheeting she had been hoarding and hiding for weeks, she fashioned a makeshift rope and hanged herself in her cell. She was 60 years old. Guards found her during their morning rounds, hanging from a pipe in the ceiling. She left no suicide note, although in the days leading up to it she had repeatedly scrawled a phrase on the walls: "Buchenwald, I always return to Buchenwald." Her death generated little public reaction. Brief newspaper articles reported the event without elaborating on its significance. By then, Ilse Koch's notoriety had been eclipsed by new global crises and the rise of contemporary figures of atrocity. Her body was handed over to local authorities, who arranged a discreet burial in an unmarked grave in a municipal cemetery in Reich. No relatives claimed her remains, no formal obituary was published. Her death, like her life, was marked by isolation and infamy. The case of Ilse Koch remains a paradigmatic study of individualized sadism within a system of institutionalized cruelty. Unlike many perpetrators who claimed obedience to superior orders, her actions transcended any functional needs of the camp. Her cruelty was not merely instrumental, but expressive, a manifestation of personal pleasure in the suffering of others. This psychological dimension distinguishes her in the pantheon of Nazi criminals and raises disturbing questions about the human capacity for perversion when all moral restraints are removed. The trials against Ilse Koch set important precedents in international jurisprudence on crimes against humanity. Her case demonstrated the challenges inherent in prosecuting atrocities committed within a criminal state system. It established standards for evaluating survivor testimony, documenting informal chains of command, and considering circumstantial evidence in the absence of written warrants. These legal innovations would inform subsequent prosecutions of war criminals in diverse global contexts. The cultural legacy of the Witch of Buchenwald has endured in complex ways. Her figure has been portrayed in numerous works of fiction, documentaries, and historical analyses. She often serves as an archetype of institutionalized female cruelty, contrasting with the tendency to systematically associate extreme violence with male perpetrators. Some depictions have tended toward sensationalism, emphasizing sexualized aspects of her crimes at the expense of a deeper analysis of her role in the Nazi system. For Buchenwald survivors, Ilse Koch's death represented a symbolic but insufficient closure. Many expressed that no punishment could adequately compensate for the suffering inflicted. Others argued that her evident mental deterioration and eventual suicide constituted a form of poetic justice, the psychological torment mirroring the physical torments she had inflicted. For most, however, the true process of recovery depended not on the fate of individual perpetrators, but on the reconstruction of lives fragmented by trauma. Decades after her death, historians continue to debate various aspects of the Koch case. Some question the authenticity of certain objects attributed to her collection, pointing to exaggerations in later accounts. Others examine how her gender influenced her media and judicial treatment, arguing that her gender heightened public fascination with her crimes. These debates reflect broader tensions in Holocaust historiography between documentary accuracy and the ethical representation of suffering. What remains indisputable is the fundamental reality of her participation in a system designed for dehumanization and extermination. Ilse Koch, regardless of later exaggerations or mythologizing, was a willing and enthusiastic participant in crimes against humanity. Her personal trajectory, from secretary in Dresden to emblematic figure of concentration camp terror, illustrates how ordinary ordinary individuals can become perpetrators of extraordinary atrocities when ideology, opportunity, and personal predisposition converge in specific historical circumstances. The final chapter of Ilse Koch's life, marked by delusions, paranoia, and self-destruction, suggests a deeper form of justice than any court sentence could provide. Her mind became a prison that reproduced in reverse the horrors she had inflicted. The ghosts she claimed to see in her cell were not random hallucinations, but manifestations of a guilt that no conscious denial could fully eradicate. Her suicide, rather than escaping punishment, can be interpreted as a final surrender to an inner judgment that had been haunting her since the fall of the Reich. In a broader sense, Ilse Koch's story offers universal lessons about the consequences of granting absolute power without accountability. It demonstrates how ideological systems that dehumanize entire categories of people create conditions where individual sadisms can flourish unchecked. Her case confirms that true protection against atrocities lies not simply in punishing perpetrators after the fact, but in maintaining constant vigilance against hateful ideologies and structures that eliminate fundamental ethical safeguards. The unmarked grave where Ilse Koch's remains lie represents a fitting end to a life defined by infamy. No monument, no commemoration, no positive legacy, only the lingering memory of actions that define the darkest boundaries of human conduct. Her deserved death formally closed her individual case, but the questions her existence raised about human nature, moral responsibility, and the possible justice in the wake of mass atrocities continue to reverberate in our collective consciousness.